In the shadow of a world set ablaze by war, a young German engineer named Karl Weber boarded a ship bound for America, carrying with him a heavy secret that could alter the course of the war. As the New York skyline loomed into view, a realization dawned upon him. The sheer might and resolve of America was unlike anything he had ever imagined. It was at this moment that Karl understood deep in his bones that Germany did not stand a chance in this war. The air was thick with the scent of burning embers and the distant echo of sirens as Karl Weber stood on the quay, staring at the vessel that was to ferry him across the ocean to a new world. He was a man torn. His brilliant mind had made him invaluable to the German war effort, yet his heart longed for an end to the bloodshed. Now, recruited for a mission cloaked in secrecy, he was to be an informant, a silent whisper in the grand cacophony of war. Karl's eyes lingered on the smoky horizon of his homeland, a silhouette of ruins and despair. The war had ravaged everything he held dear, turning the once vibrant cities into mere shadows of their former selves. He remembered the laughter in the streets, now replaced by the somber march of soldiers and the cries of the wounded. The transformation of his country into a fortress of fear and propaganda was complete, yet here he stood, about to embark on a journey that defied everything he had been taught to believe. He turned back to the ship, its massive hull a stark contrast to the fragility of his thoughts. The boarding call echoed, a deep, resounding signal that it was time to leave. With each step he took, Karl felt the weight of his decision. He was leaving behind his family, his friends, and the only life he knew. Yet, there was a flicker of hope, a chance that what he was doing could somehow make a difference, could somehow bring this madness to an end. As the ship began to pull away from the dock, Karl took one last glance at the receding shoreline. He wondered if he would ever return, if the Germany he knew would ever exist again. The cool sea breeze whipped around him, as if urging him forward, reminding him that there was no turning back now. The journey ahead was one of uncertainty and peril, a path that few had dared to tread. But Karl Weber was no ordinary man. He was a thinker, a dreamer, and now a silent soldier in a war of shadows and secrets. And as the ship cut through the waves, heading towards the distant shores of America, Karl knew that his life, and perhaps the course of the war, was about to change forever. The first sight of New York City's skyline pierced the early morning mist like a scene from a dream. Towering skyscrapers and endless streams of bustling activity welcomed Karl Weber to a land vastly different from the war-torn streets of Germany. As the ship edged closer to the harbor, the Statue of Liberty stood as a silent sentinel, her torch a symbol of hope and freedom that seemed almost alien to Karl's war-weary eyes. Stepping off the boat and onto the solid ground of the pier, Karl was immediately engulfed in a wave of sounds, smells, and sights. The air was filled with the cacophony of honking cars, shouting vendors, and the rhythmic thud of machinery. The city breathed life, its pulse racing in a tempo of progress and prosperity. It was a stark contrast to the rationed streets and somber air raids back home. Karl moved through the crowds, his suitcase clutched tightly in his hand. People from all walks of life rushed past him, each absorbed in their own world, a mosaic of cultures and stories blending together in the great American melting pot. He saw faces full of determination, eyes brimming with dreams, and it struck him how different the atmosphere was here. There was no overshadowing sense of doom, no impending threat of destruction, just the vibrant pursuit of life. As he ventured further into the city, the sheer scale of everything amazed him. Stores overflowed with goods, restaurants buzzed with patrons, and theaters advertised the latest shows. The abundance was overwhelming, almost excessive, reflecting a nation untouched by the shortages and sacrifices that had become a daily reality in Germany. Carl's first meal in America was at a small diner, where he marveled at the variety of food available. He struck up a conversation with the man sitting next to him at the counter, an affable fellow named Tom who worked at the docks. "You're German, right? Here to help with the war effort?" Tom asked between bites of his sandwich. Carl nodded, cautious not to reveal too much about his true mission. Tom seemed to sense his hesitation and smiled. "Well, whatever your reason, welcome to America, friend. You'll find we're a lot different from what you're used to." Carl could only agree silently, the truth of Tom's words resonating deeply within him. The difference was not just in the bustling streets or the towering buildings. It was in the spirit of the people, a collective energy that seemed to propel the city forward. That night, as Carl lay in his small rented room, the distant sounds of jazz and laughter drifting through the window, he realized how vast the gap was between the America he had imagined and the one he was now experiencing. It was a land of immense power and possibility, a stark contrast to the constrained and controlled life he had left behind. And as he drifted to sleep, a part of him wondered if Germany, with all its military might and strategic planning, had underestimated the giant it was challenging across the sea. Carl's first day at the American Research Facility was one he would never forget. The sprawling complex was a hive of activity, buzzing with the brightest minds from across the nation, all working tirelessly towards a singular goal: victory. As he was led through the corridors, Carl couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the scale of the operation. Rooms filled with engineers, physicists, and mathematicians all collaborated, their conversations a symphony of innovation and determination. He was introduced to his workstation, a modest desk amidst a sea of papers and blueprints. The project he was assigned to was confidential, a new type of radar technology that promised to revolutionize warfare. Carl, with his background in engineering, was immediately drawn to the task, his mind racing with the possibilities. It was here, amidst the clatter of typewriters and the hum of machinery, that Carl first met James, the colleague who would become a guide and confidant. James was a tall, charismatic figure, with a quick wit and a seemingly endless supply of optimism. He took Carl under his wing, explaining the nuances of the project and the workings of the facility. "You'll find that we do things a bit differently here," James said with a grin. "It's not just about following orders. It's about finding solutions, pushing boundaries." As the days turned into weeks, Carl delved deeper into his work, his initial apprehension giving way to a grudging respect for the American approach. The facility was a melting pot of ideas, where debate was encouraged and failure was seen not as a setback, but as a step toward success. He was particularly struck by the collaborative spirit, a stark contrast to the rigid hierarchy he was used to. The more time he spent at the facility, the more Carl realized the enormity of American industrial and scientific capacity. He heard stories of vast factories, churning out planes and tanks at an unprecedented rate, and of projects so ambitious they seemed like fiction. It was a world away from the resource-strapped workshops and laboratories back in Germany. One afternoon, as he and James worked late into the evening, the conversation turned to the war. "You know, Carl," James said, his voice serious for once, "this isn't just about building better weapons. It's about what comes after, about shaping a world where this kind of conflict can't happen again." Carl listened, a knot forming in his stomach. He thought of his own country, of the propaganda and the fervor that had swept through it, and wondered if such a future was possible. As weeks turned into months, Carl's sense of wonder began to mingle with a gnawing sense of doubt. The project he was working on was nearing completion, its potential clear and its implications profound. He began to understand that the technological gap between the United States and Germany was not just a matter of resources, but of philosophy, of how one viewed and approached the world. It was during a test of the new radar system, as he watched the blips on the screen representing planes miles away, that the realization fully hit him. The United States was not just another player in the war. It was a behemoth of innovation and industry, a country whose capacity for production and technological advancement was unmatched. That evening, as Karl sat alone in his room, the weight of what he had learned pressing down on him, he knew that the war was not just a clash of armies, but of ideologies, of ways of life. And in that moment, he couldn't help but feel that Germany, for all its might and strategy, was fighting a losing battle. As autumn painted the city in shades of orange and red, Karl's immersion into American life deepened. His daily routine was no longer just about the work at the research facility. It now included small talks with locals, strolls through bustling streets, and the occasional evening spent at the cinema or a jazz club. With each passing day, he felt the pulse of the city and its people, a rhythm of life so starkly different from the one he had known. One crisp morning, Karl found himself walking through a neighborhood teeming with life. Children played in the streets, their laughter a carefree melody against the backdrop of adults discussing the day's news. The headlines were always about the war, about sons and husbands overseas, and the latest from the front lines. But it was the conversations that followed that caught Karl's attention. There was worry and fear, certainly, but there was also a prevailing sense of determination and unity. The war was a collective endeavor here, everyone contributing in their own way, whether by working in factories, buying war bonds, or sending care packages to troops. As he continued his walks, Karl began to engage more with the people he met. He was cautious at first, mindful of his accent and his status as a foreigner, but he found a surprising openness, a willingness to share stories and listen. One afternoon, he found himself in a conversation with an elderly man named Mr. Johnson, who sat on his porch, whittling wood. "We all got to do our part," Mr. Johnson said, his hands working deftly. "My boys are out there fighting, and I'm here making sure they've got what they need. It's tough, sure, but we're all in this together." It was in these moments that Karl began to understand the indomitable spirit of the American people. It wasn't just the might of their military or the scale of their industry. It was the collective will, the shared belief in their cause and their country. This was a nation that had mobilized in a way that seemed inconceivable, a united front of civilians and soldiers alike. The realization was both humbling and alarming. Back home, propaganda fueled the war effort, painting a picture of inevitable victory and unrivaled power. But here, amidst the ration lines and the war rallies, Karl saw a different kind of strength, one born out of democracy and the collective will of a free people. One evening, as he sat in a diner, Karl overheard a group of factory workers discussing the latest shipment of tanks and planes. Their pride was palpable, a sense of ownership and contribution to the war effort. "We're going to beat them Axis powers, you just wait and see," one man said, his voice loud and confident. The others nodded, their agreement mixed with a sense of solemnity. It wasn't just talk, it was a deep-seated belief that they were part of something bigger, something worth fighting for. As Karl lay in bed that night, the voices and stories swirling in his mind, he felt a stirring of something he hadn't expected: admiration. Admiration for the resilience and unity of a nation under siege, for the way every man, woman, and child seemed to stand shoulder to shoulder against the threat. And with that admiration came a growing realization, a quiet acknowledgement of the daunting task his own country faced. For in every factory worker, every mother sending care packages, every child collecting scrap metal, there was an unwavering spirit, a determination that was both the armor and the weapon of America. And against such a spirit, Karl couldn't help but wonder, did Germany stand a chance at all? The leaves had turned golden, and a chill had begun to settle in the air when Karl was invited by James to visit his family in a small Midwestern town. It was an opportunity to see America beyond the urban sprawl and industry, to experience the heartland where the values and traditions of the country were deeply rooted. Accepting the invitation with a mixture of curiosity and eagerness, Karl boarded a train, leaving behind the ceaseless energy of the city. As the landscape shifted from towering buildings to sprawling fields and quaint farmhouses, Karl felt as if he were traveling not just through space, but also back in time. The pace of life here was slower, more deliberate, with a sense of community that was palpable. James's hometown was a picture of Americana, with its main street lined with shops, a local diner, and a cinema that boasted the latest Hollywood flicks. The visit coincided with the town's annual 4th of July celebration, a day filled with parades, picnics, and a palpable sense of patriotism. Karl watched as families gathered, flags waving proudly, children laughing and running with sparklers. It was a scene of joy and unity, a community coming together to celebrate their nation's independence, their freedom. James introduced Karl to his family and friends, explaining him as a colleague from the city. People were warm and welcoming, curious about the foreigner in their midst, but never unkind. Karl found himself swept up in conversations, sharing stories of Germany, cautiously at first, but then with more ease as he realized the genuine interest of his listeners. As the day progressed, Karl was struck by the speeches given by local leaders, veterans, and community members. They spoke of sacrifice and honor, of the duty to protect the freedoms they held so dear. The words resonated with Karl, reminding him of the propaganda back home. But here, it was different. It wasn't about superiority or conquest. It was about defending a way of life, values that were shared and cherished by everyone in the community. As the sun set and the fireworks lit up the sky, Karl found himself standing next to an old man, his face etched with lines of age and experience. They watched in silence as bursts of color illuminated the night, a spectacle of light and sound that had the crowd oohing and aahing. After a moment, the old man turned to Karl and said, "Beautiful, isn't it? It's all for our independence, for our freedom. It's something you never really appreciate until it's threatened." Karl nodded, his thoughts a tumult of emotions. He thought about his own country, torn apart by a war that seemed more and more senseless with each passing day. He thought about the propaganda, the rallies, the fervor that had swept up so many, including himself, at one time. And then he thought about the people here, their sense of community, their love for their country, and their determination to protect it. As the celebration drew to a close and people began to disperse, Karl felt a profound sense of clarity. The strength of America didn't lie solely in its military or its industry. It was in its people, their shared values, and their unwavering spirit. For the first time since setting foot in the United States, Karl allowed himself to believe that perhaps Germany did not stand a chance in this war, not because of the might it faced, but because of the spirit it underestimated. And as he lay in bed that night, in the quiet of the small Midwestern town, Karl knew that his own path, his own choices, were about to change. Conflicted loyalties ***. As the war continued to rage across oceans and continents, the days in the research facility became increasingly fraught with urgency. Karl's project was on the cusp of completion, its potential to change the dynamics of the war becoming more apparent with each passing day. Yet, as he delved deeper into his work, the weight of his secret mission pressed heavily upon him. He was a man caught between two worlds, entrusted with information that could shape the outcome of the war. The more he learned about the American war effort, the more conflicted he became. He had seen the might and determination of a nation united against tyranny, witnessed firsthand the spirit of the American people. Yet he was still bound by a sense of duty to his homeland, to the family and friends he had left behind. Karl began to send coded messages back to Germany, reports filled with observations and insights. But as the war dragged on, his communications took on a different tone. He no longer spoke of strategies or weaknesses. Instead, he tried to convey the futility of continued conflict, the overwhelming force and resolve of the Allied nations. He hoped, perhaps naively, that his words might sway the minds of those in power, that they might see reason before more lives were lost. His double life took its toll on Karl. He lived in constant fear of discovery, aware that his actions could be seen as betrayal by both sides. He wrestled with guilt and uncertainty, torn between his desire to end the war and his loyalty to his countrymen. One evening, as he sat alone in his room, Karl received a letter from home. It was from his sister, a simple note filled with tales of daily life and the hope that they would soon be reunited. But between the lines, Karl read the truth of the situation, the hardships and the suffering that had become commonplace. The letter was a stark reminder of what was at stake, of the real human cost of the war. As the months passed, Karl's sense of isolation grew. He was a stranger in a foreign land, a man without a country. He found solace in his work, in the routine of the research facility, but it was a cold comfort. He longed for the war to end, for a return to some semblance of normalcy. One day, James approached him, a serious look on his face. "Karl, I know you've been through a lot," he said, "but you need to know that what we're doing here, it's important. It's bigger than any of us. We're fighting for the future, for a world where people can live free from tyranny." Karl looked at James, at the earnestness in his eyes, and felt a surge of emotion. Here was a man who believed so deeply in the cause, who saw beyond the immediate horror of war to the possibility of a better world. It was a vision that Karl wanted to share, but he was still bound by the past, by a loyalty that was increasingly difficult to justify. As the war entered its final brutal stages, Karl found himself at a crossroads. He continued to send his reports, his messages a mix of fact and subtle plea. But he knew that the time for subtlety was passing, that soon he would have to make a choice about where his true loyalties lay. In the end, it was the news of the Allied advances, the reports of liberated towns and cities, that made up his mind. The war was turning, the tide of history shifting beneath his feet. And Karl Weber, once a loyal son of Germany, now stood with the rest of the world, hoping for an end to the bloodshed, for a chance to rebuild from the ashes of conflict. The final months of the war were a whirlwind of activity and anticipation. News of Allied victories trickled in, each one a beacon of hope in the prolonged darkness of conflict. Karl, entrenched in his work at the research facility, felt the shift in the air, a collective breath being held as the end seemed increasingly within reach. The facility was abuzz with rumors and speculation, mixed with a cautious optimism. The project Karl had been working on was nearing its final stages, its contribution to the war effort soon to be realized. Yet for Karl, the impending success was bittersweet. He knew that his own role in all this was tenuous, his future uncertain once the war ended. It was during these tumultuous times that Karl received another letter from home, this one tinged with a different sentiment. There was a sense of resignation, a weary acceptance of the inevitable defeat. His sister spoke of the devastation, of cities reduced to rubble and lives irrevocably changed. But there was also a hint of hope, a desire to move forward, to rebuild from the ruins. The letter struck a chord in Karl, reaffirming his decision to stand against the regime that had brought so much suffering. As the final push by the Allies began, the news came more rapidly. Cities were being liberated, concentration camps uncovered, the true horror of the war laid bare for the world to see. In the facility, work continued, but now there was a sense of urgency, a rush to complete what they had started before the war's end. Karl watched as the American spirit, so indomitable and resilient, seemed to surge with each victory. Parades were planned, families prepared to welcome home their soldiers, and the nation readied itself for peace. Yet, amidst the celebrations, there was a solemnity, a recognition of the cost at which victory had come. In the final days of the war, as Karl awaited news like everyone else, he found himself reflecting on his journey. He had come to America as a spy, a man caught between two worlds, and now he was a witness to one of the most significant moments in history. He thought about the people he had met, the stories he had heard, and the spirit of a nation that had welcomed him, albeit unknowingly, into its fold. When the announcement finally came, the war's end declared, the facility erupted in cheers and tears. Karl stood amongst his colleagues, feeling a surge of relief and sorrow. He knew that the world would never be the same, that the scars of this war would run deep for generations to come. But there was also a sense of hope, a belief that from the ashes of conflict, a new world could rise, one based on the principles of freedom and democracy. As the celebrations continued around him, Karl felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had played a small part in this vast, complex war, but his actions, he hoped, had contributed to this moment of victory. And as he looked to the future, to the task of rebuilding and moving forward, he knew that his own life would be forever entwined with the fate of the nation that had once been his enemy. Now, standing in the aftermath of victory, he was ready to face whatever came next, to help build a world where the horrors of the past would never be repeated. As peace settled over the world, a palpable sense of relief and anticipation for the future pervaded the air. In the aftermath of victory, the world was reshaping itself, countries rebuilding and alliances reforming. For Karl, the end of the war marked a new beginning, an opportunity to redefine his place in this changed landscape. The research facility's work had not ceased with the war's end. If anything, it had gained a new direction. The technology developed during the conflict was now being repurposed for peacetime applications. Karl was offered the chance to stay on, to contribute to this new era of innovation. The offer was more than a continuation of employment. It was an acknowledgement of his skills and an opportunity to remain in the country that had become his refuge. The decision to stay in the United States was not made lightly. Karl's thoughts often drifted back to his family and friends in Germany, to the streets and memories of his youth. The country he left behind was now a shadow of its former self, divided and devastated. The reports he received were filled with tales of hardship and struggle, but also of hope and determination to rebuild. Accepting the offer, Karl began his new life as an immigrant in a country that had once been the enemy. He applied for citizenship, a process filled with paperwork and interviews, but also with a sense of finality. This was his commitment to a new identity, to becoming a part of the fabric of American society. As he integrated more into the community, Karl found a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He made friends, joined local organizations, and even started teaching at a nearby university, sharing his knowledge and experience with eager young minds. The America he had first experienced as a foreigner now welcomed him as one of its own. Yet, even as he built this new life, Karl never forgot the lessons of the war. He became an advocate for peace and cooperation, using his story and insights to educate others about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of understanding between nations. His experiences had given him a unique perspective, one that he felt compelled to share, to ensure that the world would never again descend into such darkness. Years passed, and Karl watched as the world continued to change. New conflicts arose, but also new advancements, new hopes for a better future. He saw the first steps on the moon, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the turning of the century, each a milestone in the ongoing march of human progress. As an old man, Karl would often sit in his study, surrounded by books and mementos from a life fully lived. He thought of the young engineer who had stepped onto American soil all those years ago, full of fear and uncertainty. That man had been shaped by the war, by the choices he had made, and the paths he had taken. And now, as he looked back, Karl realized that his greatest achievement was not the technology he had helped develop or the accolades he had received. It was the simple act of choosing a new home, a new life, and in doing so, finding a peace that had once seemed so elusive. In the quiet twilight of his years, Karl Weber, once a stranger in a strange land, now rested content in the knowledge that he had played a part in shaping a world striving towards unity and understanding, a world he was proud to call home. Years had woven silver threads into Karl's hair, and the lines on his face told stories of a life rich with experience and contemplation. Sitting in his favorite chair by the window, he gazed out at the peaceful neighborhood that had become his world, a far cry from the tumultuous days of his youth. The quiet of the afternoon was a luxury he had learned to cherish, a time for reflection and memory. In the solitude of his study, surrounded by books that had become his steadfast companions, Karl often found himself drifting back in time. The war, with all its horror and heroism, seemed like a distant echo, a different life lived by a different man. Yet, the lessons it had taught him remained ever present, a guiding force in his journey. Karl had lived through the aftermath of the war, seen the world rebuild and reshape itself in ways he could never have imagined. He had watched as former enemies became allies, as nations vowed to never repeat the mistakes of the past, and through it all, he had contributed in his own way, sharing his knowledge and experience, advocating for peace and understanding. Now, as an old man, Karl's legacy was not just in the projects he had worked on or the students he had taught. It was in the stories he shared, the wisdom he imparted. He had become a testament to the power of change, of the capacity for individuals to learn and grow, to turn away from paths of destruction and towards those of reconciliation and peace. His family, both in America and back in Germany, were a source of great pride and joy. His children and grandchildren knew of his past, of the choices he had made and the reasons behind them. They saw in him not just a figure from a history book, but a living example of courage and transformation. In the quiet moments of introspection, Karl often thought about his fellow countrymen, about the people all over the world who had been touched by the war. He wondered about their stories, their own journeys of hardship and healing. He hoped that, like him, they had found some measure of peace, some way to make sense of the chaos that had once consumed their lives. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Karl Weber, once a man caught between nations, now sat content in the knowledge that his story was part of a larger tapestry, woven through the years with threads of hope, resilience, and an unyielding belief in the possibility of a better future. His was a life defined not by the war he had fought, but by the peace he had chosen. And as the day faded into twilight, Karl knew that his reflections, his very existence, were a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, a spirit capable of great destruction, but also of boundless love and profound transformation. This was the legacy he would leave behind, a message of hope and redemption for generations to come.